Thank you very much, Father Kale, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to Nadia Barsoum as well for cajoling me. And I apologize at the outset for the very long question that was posed as the title. And I think I am going to blame Father Kale for this, because that wasn't what I had suggested as a title. That was simply a question I had posed to him in response to, as many of us, I think, who were in communication with Father Kale. It was an extraordinary, actually a very nice, generous, on his part, back and forth about the conference and clarifying some of the questions I had about the conference and so on. So I never intended that very long question to be a title, but in any case, there you have it. What I'd like to talk about today is, in fact, this question that I think many of us yesterday and today have been circling around, which is how do we elevate, and can we elevate or engage in a discussion about religious diversity and Christians in the Middle East without falling into the extraordinarily pernicious and tired, politicized discourse of minorities. And I'd like to make a few preliminary comments, speak for about maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then move on to what everyone I think wants to do, which is to get to the final session and summarize the conference. So just by way of introduction, I'd like to acknowledge, of course, that there are, as everyone here knows, there are obviously massive real problems in the Middle East. And I was talking to some colleagues here at Villanova yesterday about this, Hiba in particular, where she's in the back there. And so there obviously are massive, huge existential questions, real problems, real histories of discrimination in the Middle East, legacies of discrimination that long predate Western imperialism, US imperialism, US, quote, interventionism, invasions, and so on and so forth. So from the outset, let's acknowledge that there are real histories, so-called indigenous or local factors and causes that all of us should discuss and should be aware of. And at the same time, of course, there is an extraordinary, obvious, overwhelming, Elizabeth mentioned it in the last session, a history of framing and a history of Western imperialism and intervention, geopolitics, that have profoundly altered, shaped, reshaped, distorted the region that we call the Middle East. And so the challenge for every single scholar, every single humanist, every single person who believes in those three sort of ideals of Villanova, the challenge, of course, is to try to think about the Middle East and the question of religious minorities and the question of persecution, alleged persecution and real tribulations and sufferings of people in the Middle East, irrespective of their religious denomination or faith. The real question is how to talk both about local factors and external factors at the same time. In other words, to move away from binaries and to move towards a dialectic, the idea of reinforcing local and foreign, reinforcing each other, always bearing in mind that there are massive structures of power, there are huge imbalances of power. And so in that sense, to echo what Elizabeth and Brian before me, and Rami to an extent before me, have all sort of made this point over and over again. And so again, I echo that, as opposed to some of the previous interventions here, which exhibited, particularly, let's say, the official intervention, which is sort of a willful denial of this extraordinary dialectic that has made the Middle East what it is today, and to move away from what I see, and what I think what many of us here see as a transient and opportunistic politics of concern that we often are exposed to, and in this conference in particular, we were exposed to in parts. And so I'd like to make a few points. One is to underscore the point that the discourse about religious minorities has been part of a century at least. And again, I completely echo what Elizabeth was saying, a century of entitlement, representation, and in a sense unmitigated Orientalism and paternalism that has obscured the history, the context, and the politics of the Middle East and its peoples. The second point I'd like to make is to emphasize how the question of religion and religious diversity and the problem of equality are not, of course, simply Middle Eastern problems. As Brian mentioned several times very movingly, these are obviously universal problems. We see them in the United States. Anyone who thinks today in the United States understands and sees just how much of a universal problem this is in Europe, in the US, in South Asia, in the Middle East, everywhere. And so, again, the challenge for us is to talk about the Middle East and to appreciate the particularities of the Middle East without descending into a kind of Orientalist representation of the Middle East. And finally, the last 2 points by way of introduction, to underscore the crucial point that the Middle East does not simply exist. This is a point I make to all my students over and over again. The Middle East has been made and unmade repeatedly, beginning in the modern period, in other words, in the 19th century, all the way until today. And most recently, of course, under America's watch, especially in the period post-1967 until today. In a similar vein, and this is the last point by way of introduction, the question of minorities and religious minorities does not simply exist. These are not objective categories. Minorities are imagined, they are made, they are unmade. Nobody is born a minority or a majority. People, as we know, are born and then they are socialized and politicized into various categories. Okay, so then, that is the obvious problem. The question is, how then do we try to begin to undo as scholars? And that's what I'm speaking of my background as a scholar, a professor. I'm not into policy, and I'm not into sort of any of those other things. But as scholars, how do we begin as people thinking about the problem of religious minorities that many of my colleagues have talked about yesterday and today? How do we begin to talk about the problems of persecution or discrimination in the Middle East, keeping in mind the dialectic, moving away from the binaries? And the first and most obvious way is to historicize. In other words, to put everything in its specific context. And that, of course, is what many of us here have done. Others have not done. I understand that some people cannot historicize, will not historicize, but scholars have to historicize. In other words, they have to put every single moment of discrimination in its particular social, political, and economic context. And that means moving away, first and foremost, from a notion that there is this thing called the medievalized sectarian Middle East as opposed to the secular West, to move away from these huge binaries and to move towards an understanding of, just like in the US, there's a problem of race. In the Middle East, there is a problem you could think of sectarianism. These are, in a sense, parallel formations in very different parts of the world. But just as the very best US scholars have done an extraordinary job in historicizing race and racial categories and racial thought and racial politics and the history of race in this country, so too we have to be attentive to doing the same thing in terms of sect and sectarianism in the Middle East. And so we should avoid what some people often do when they talk about the Middle East. We should try to avoid talking about people simply as Muslims or Christians or Jews or Kurds or X or Y, and try to understand, again, the depth and the complexity of these identities. Rami mentioned that people have multiple hats, and it's not just multiple hats, they often wear them at the same time. So I don't know what the metaphor is, but a series of hats. Just like in the US, Barack Obama is not simply African American. There's so many other things that he is, and to reduce him simply to being an African American does extraordinary violence to what President Obama is, what he represents, and so too in the case of the Middle East. And then this gets me to the point about primordialism, and Tariq Mitri gave a very eloquent presentation yesterday, but the idea of communal identities themselves is something that we have to constantly interrogate, because communal identities do not simply exist. It's not that there's religious identities and communal identities. Communal identities themselves are constantly being made and manufactured and disciplined and remade over and over again. And the reason I have to emphasize this is because that's the only way for us to start thinking about people and history in more complex, more nuanced, more humane ways than we currently do. And that's why, of course, there was an Inquisition, there are religious orders, there are schools, Islamic and Christian and Jewish schools, voluntary societies, and so on, precisely because people have to be indoctrinated, educated, shaped, and reshaped. So, to go to the point of the talk, which is the history, let's talk a bit and historicize a bit this notion of inequality and the Islamic past. And I want to focus here a little bit on the Ottoman period, which is what I specialize in, the 19th century in particular. There obviously is, to understand Christians and religious minorities in the Middle East, we have to understand Ottoman history, that is to say the history of the period of the Middle East that we today call the Middle East, that was ruled by the Ottoman Sultanate, depending on which part of the Middle East, but in the Arab part from 1516, 1517, all the way until the end of the First World War. There obviously, you could, without any shadow of a doubt, every scholar, every historian of the Ottoman Empire understands that there was a history of Ottoman imperialism, there was supremacy, there was legal and ideological supremacy, there was a discrimination on the basis of religion, and of course on the basis of a dynastic rule, Ottoman dynastic rule. These are all sort of matters of record. There was, of course, also a very real history of the lived experience of many different kinds of Christian communities, which was never simply a history of persecution and never simply a history of only discrimination. And so I think the parallels of thinking about Christians as simply persecuted or simply discriminated against obscures the richness and the vibrancy of non-Muslim existence in the Ottoman period. So again, to emphasize, the Christians in the Middle East and non-Muslims in the Middle East were never in the same category as blacks in America. And the reason I make this point over and over again is because I am extremely aware of how the Middle East is constantly being represented, and I insist that we should always maintain in the back of our minds a sense of empathy rather than always judging the Middle East. And so just bear in mind a couple of points. There was, as I said, legal and ideological discrimination. Muslim subjects and Islam was unquestionably privileged in the Ottoman era all the way until the end of the empire. And yet, since many of us know Lebanon and have come from Lebanon, and I'm sure the same is true in what is today Turkey and in Syria and in other parts of the Middle East, despite this discrimination, and despite the so-called Pact of Omar that some of you mentioned yesterday, the reality is that if you go to Lebanon today and you look around and you see the churches in Lebanon and the monasteries in Lebanon, virtually every single one is built in the Ottoman period, despite the fact that officially you're not allowed to build, according to the Pact of Omar, new churches and new monasteries. But across the Ottoman Empire, in fact, churches were built. What does that mean? Again, it points to a slightly more complex picture than we are used to. The other point is that certain communities in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, for instance, were not persecuted by the Ottoman state until the very end of the empire. In other words, in the 1890s, and then, of course, the genocide during the First World War. And the question is, why then, as opposed to centuries earlier? And that's another question we should bear in mind. The third point is that despite the fact that Islam was the dominant religion, it is crucial to understand that Christians were not second-class citizens. Muslims were not citizens. Muslims were subjects of the state, just like non-Muslims. Everybody was subordinate to the house of Osman. Everybody was a subject. Nobody had political rights in any modern sense of the word. So it's important, again, to bear that in mind. It's only in 1876, when the first Ottoman constitution was written, was a concept of secular political rights in the way that we understand it, was introduced to all citizens, irrespective of religious affiliation. The problem, of course, is the shift in the Ottoman Empire from discrimination, formal legal disabilities and discrimination against non-Muslims and against subjects of the empire towards equality and citizenship in 1876. This shift occurs at exactly the moment of massive European pressure, imperialism, interventionism, Balkan nationalism, and so on and so forth. There was an extraordinary coincidence, and it's not just a coincidence, between a shift away from formal discrimination under European pressure and the rise of European imperialism in the Ottoman Empire. And this is the central, I think, the great tragedy and the central dynamic that animates so much of the history of the Middle East. There's one shift away from discrimination, and there's at the same exact time as there's enormous coercive European pressure on the Ottoman Empire. So think about 1876, there's a constitution, there's a declaration of equality of citizens irrespective of religious affiliation, and yet there's also Ottoman bankruptcy. There's also, we're on the cusp of the British occupation of Egypt. Where it's during an Ottoman-Russian war. It's at a moment when the Balkans are being, all the Balkan states are moving away from Ottoman sovereignty. There's a crisis of sovereignty, and there's also emancipation. And this is the great sort of problem. The problem of emancipation and the era of emancipation occurs in a moment of extreme pressure and enormous war, endless war. There's a series of wars where the Ottoman state is involved in, beginning in the mid-19th century Crimean War, going all the way till the end of the empire. The empire is basically at war almost constantly in this period. Hence, it's because of this dynamic, emancipation under European pressure for non-Muslim subjects occurring at exactly the same time as European pressure, which is why the first anti-Christian sectarian riots that take place in the Ottoman Empire occur, in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire occur in Aleppo in 1850 and in Damascus in 1860. The very cities that are in the news today, these riots occur in 1850 and 1860. These are the first major riots. Damascus, 1860, July 1860, is the largest single anti-Christian riot that takes place in the Ottoman period, but it's not simply a sectarian riot. Obviously, there's a sectarian dimension because Christians are scapegoated, but there's also issues of conscription. Muslims were being conscripted, Christians were not being conscripted, and to be conscripted into the army meant basically to face an extraordinarily precarious existence. Taxes were on the increase, and of course, as I said, European imperialism constantly singled out Christians as objects of alleged favor. And so there's this coincidence between emancipation and European intervention. So the history of minorities and the discourse about freeing minorities and about saving Christians in the Middle East has from the outset been inextricably tied to the politics of Western interventionism and imperialism. European states said they had a right and a duty to interfere in Ottoman affairs, and the first sectarian mechanisms that the very first speaker yesterday, unless I misunderstood him, in fact advocated more sectarian mechanisms. He without completely oblivious, it seems to me, he was to the fact that sectarian mechanisms were introduced into the Ottoman Empire, sectarian quota systems that the US has been aggressively pushing in the case of Iraq and is being mooted today for Syria. The very first sectarian mechanisms were put in place in Mount Lebanon in the mid-19th century, precisely at this moment when the Ottoman sovereignty was being diminished and the Europeans were intervening. And so the Ottoman state understood, and Ottoman officials understood from the beginning, that sectarian mechanisms that allegedly guarantee equal representation or equitable representation for minority communities is directly connected to a diminishment of sovereignty, which is why when the European powers in the 19th century suggest that similar sectarian mechanisms should have been implemented in the Balkans, in Crete, in Bosnia, in Anatolia in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Ottoman state goes out of its way to reject these sectarian quota systems because everybody in the Middle East understood at the time and still understands that sectarian quota systems are not simply about emancipation, they're also about an abrogation and a diminishment of sovereignty, which is why, and this gets to Elizabeth's point, why the Ottoman state, by the end of the 19th century, is obsessed with the idea of, okay, well, if the question is, either we have minorities, which is going to invite European pressure and imperialism, or sovereignty, we're going to choose sovereignty. And so what does the Ottoman state do in the late 19th century? In response to the Balkan crises, in response to the rise of Balkan Christian nationalism, the Ottoman state singles out the Armenians first and then the Greeks of Anatolia as people who no longer belong, can no longer stay in this region, because to stay in this region is to invite fragmentation, secession, and European imperialism. Which is why, if we've ever wondered, why is the Armenian question in the 1890s and not in the 1790s and not in the 1690s and not in the 1590s, despite the fact that Armenians had been in this empire from the beginning? Why in the 1890s? Well, precisely because of the rise of nationalism and an Ottoman-Turkish, I would say, obsession. I'm not justifying their obsession. There was an extraordinary policy of violence directed at Armenians and then eventually Greeks during the First World War, and eventually after the First World War, when Greece and Turkey have this massive population exchange in the 1920s. And so the Greek and Turkish model is basically we get rid of the religious minorities effectively and essentially by population exchange, ethnic cleansing. And that, of course, was one of the great tragedies of the modern era. The irony of all this, given our obsession today with ISIS, is that the Levant, the Mashriq, the areas of today Syria, Lebanon, to an extent Iraq, Israel, the Palestinian territories, including, of course, East Jerusalem, and other areas, all this region, and Egypt, all this region, unlike Anatolia and unlike the Balkans, in the late 19th century all the way to the middle of the 20th century, was an era where there was no ethnic cleansing, where there was no major nationalist question, especially in the late 19th century. There was no Arab nationalist question as a major thing in the late 19th century. There was no crisis between Muslim and Christian, despite the 1860 massacres. There was no major intercommunal crisis in the Levant. And that's the part that I think scholars have completely missed, that there's an Armenian genocide occurring at exactly the same time as there is a belle epoque of Arab Christianity in the Levant. And I think this is something we have to bear in mind and keep in mind. And then, of course, the question is what happens after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which didn't just collapse, it was destroyed. And again, I'm not an advocate in any way, shape, or form of the Ottoman state, because the Ottoman state in the late period was extraordinarily violent, particularly towards those communities which it identified as enemy communities, the Armenians and then the Greeks. And then, as I said, there was a population exchange after the war. So what happens is that the Europeans come into this extraordinarily complex land, and what they do is they, of course, everyone, this is a story I don't need to go into many details, but the Europeans look at the Middle East and the Levant in extraordinarily sectarian terms. And what's interesting is that they think of, and the legacies are still with us today in how we think about the Middle East, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, this constant emphasis on religious affiliation. And underlying that is a notion that somehow secular citizenship in the Middle East, which gets to the title of the conference, is somehow an impossible concept. Hence, you have to always emphasize one's parochial or communal affiliation rather than a secular affiliation, because somehow in America, despite the massive, extraordinary range of violence in this country, including a civil war, and extraordinary race relations and problems of race relations in this country, nevertheless, one still believes, at least at a constitutional and legal level, in a secular concept of citizenship. But when it comes to the Middle East, we talk about trusteeship and we talk about other sorts of ideas as if people in the Middle East are doomed to always be something antithetical to one another. But it is, if you look at the record, quite clear that it's after the First World War, with the introduction of British and French rule in the Middle East, that the newest conflict that Rami correctly said is the living link, if that's the words Rami used, the living link between the 19th century and today. The Arab-Israeli conflict was created not in the 19th century, but in fact in the 20th century. And remember, in the 19th century, the great struggle in the Ottoman Empire was between Muslim and non-Muslim, and specifically about Christians and how to emancipate Christians and bring them into, and how this issue of citizenship would be elaborated in the Ottoman Empire, but there was no Jewish question in the Ottoman Empire as a major question in the way that there was a Jewish question in Europe. It's only in the 20th century, after the British occupation of Palestine and the introduction of the Balfour Declaration and the introduction of Zionism, that a new conflict emerges in the Middle East between Jews and non-Jews. And it's a completely different conflict that's superimposed over an earlier Ottoman history. And of course, that has massive consequences, both for Palestinians and of course for Jewish communities in Palestine and outside of Palestine, in Iraq, in Yemen, in North Africa, and so on. The British and the French, of course, the French create Lebanon, the French divide Syria, as everyone here knows, into various sectarian states, and then beyond that you have, of course, in the post-Cold War, in the Cold War and post-Cold War period, you have an extraordinary range of US interventionisms and invasions and sort of support for Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the Shah's Iran, which I don't need to go into, and Sadat in Egypt, and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. It becomes an extraordinarily complex story that to talk about religious minorities in the abstract becomes almost becomes impossible. And so again, I want to go back to where I began, which is with this question and the challenge we all face, which is acknowledging real problems of inequality in the Middle East that we can think of as local factors without letting imperialism and Western violence and Western representation and Orientalism off the hook. And vice versa, to talk about Western imperialism and Orientalism and so on without letting local factors and local agents off the hook, but not pretending that these are always the same and always equivalent. The great challenge all of us face, I think, as scholars, as human beings, as people who believe in veritas and caritas, is in fact to talk about both at the same time, and to do so without defensiveness, with integrity, with honesty, and as Brian, I think, put it so nicely, with humility is the word he used, with humility, and to sort of, again, emphasize a dialectic rather than binaries, because it's the binaries, I think, that inevitably get us into these terrible sort of choices that we are confronted with in the Middle East today. Thank you.
Thank you again. My name is Faris Sukur. I am, just like my background, I'm Filipino, Palestinian, and I'm a student here at Villanova. My question is surrounding the idea of agreeing with the notion that communal identities are not primordial. And I definitely agree with that, but my question more so focuses on kind of how do we get people out of that primordial mindset going, I see like education is a solution, but sometimes the access isn't there. And kind of like, how do you deal with that if it's nurtured through the state? Like in my head, bin Palestine wa Israel, like how do you, with like all these laws and permits and all that kind of stuff, how do you get the reconciliation between those two?
Between which two?
I mean, between the going away from the primordial.
No, I mean, okay, so in a sense, the first and foremost answer is that a scholar and truth and sort of, it's not, I'm not a policymaker as such, and so the first and foremost approach is to historicize. As soon as you start historicizing, the primordialists have nothing to stand on. Because if you go into history and you start telling them contextualize, you'll see almost nobody who's a primordialist actually knows very much history. And as soon as you push them a bit, they realize, well, a Maronite is not the same in the 18th century as a Maronite is in the 19th century, as a Maronite was in the 14th and 15th. These are completely different categories. And so that's the first point I always emphasize. Again, your job and my job, at least, is to historicize and to question and to be critical. And then beyond that, I'm not sure what it's not to deny the fact that states obviously manipulate and create all sorts of communal identities and national identities that are essential and essentializing and violent in many respects. But that is precisely the job of humanists and scholars, is to question that and to challenge that.
Let me bring the mic over. No, thank you.
Thank you. My question is
precisely related to part of the answer. I have a problem with understanding continuity of these Christian communities in the Middle East and their relation to what they think they represent from the early centuries. Many seem to think that because they are Maronite or Melkite or whatever, that they really represent the Melkites of the 4th and 5th century or the Maronite. So I have a difficulty trying to make sense of that representation and continuity. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I have the same difficulty, but of course the point is that there's a huge difference between the idea of saying there have been Maronites or Melkites or whatever community you want to focus on, Jews or any other group or community in the Middle East, and there's a continuous presence is one thing, and then to say it's the same kind of presence is something completely different. And the implications of that presence changes dramatically. And that is the point, again, you go back to this question, you don't have to deny the fact that there has been a presence, to use again a term that was evoked at the very opening session, there's been a presence in the Middle East of various communities. The question, of course, for scholars and for historians in particular is to say, and for students of history, is to constantly question, not out of ill intent, but out of genuine scholarly curiosity, what does this presence mean? What did it mean then? What are its implications? And these are completely different from the politicized knowledge that is presented to us in places like Lebanon, where people talk about communities as if these communities have existed in the same way forever, which has never been the case.